Welcome to Top Amazing Fact. During the Apollo space missions, astronauts recorded some truly eerie sounds that still send chills down our spines. NASA often highlights the incredible scientific discoveries and groundbreaking achievements from these missions, especially the historic moment of landing a human on the moon. However, there's a side of the story that NASA tends to keep quiet about: the enormous risks and dangers the astronauts face to make it all happen. Traveling to space is challenging, but what's even more difficult is making it back to Earth in one piece. So, which Apollo missions were the most dangerous, and what did these brave astronauts endure to bring back a piece of the cosmos? On the morning of July 16, 1969, American astronaut Buzz Aldrin carefully placed a small bowl of breadcrumbs and a handwritten postcard with a Bible verse into a tiny vacuum-sealed bag. In just a few hours, he was set to achieve something no one in the history of humankind had ever done before. He would step onto the surface of the moon as part of the Apollo 11 mission. However, this wasn't Buzz Aldrin's first time in space. As a member of the Apollo 8 crew, he had already completed a manned orbital flight around the moon. The first 10 Apollo missions were all about testing spacecraft, developing new technology for space travel, and training the astronauts for the challenges they would face. But this time was different. Buzz and his fellow astronaut, Commander Neil Armstrong, were not just going to observe the moon from a distance, they were going to land on it. The mission was the result of decades of work by a team of 4,000 dedicated people, and Buzz himself had spent 2 years preparing for this incredible journey. The astronaut was completely confident in the mission's success and had no worries at all. Buzz Aldrin casually slipped the bag he had prepared into his pocket and went on with his duties, unaware of the ordeal that lay ahead. The launch of the Saturn V rocket was broadcast live on TV in 33 countries across 6 continents. In the United States alone, about 25 million viewers tuned in to watch. At the moment of liftoff, Buzz felt a euphoria that could rival that of any rock star. After a successful launch, it took the astronauts 3 days to reach the moon. Finally, the long-awaited moment arrived. The lunar module separated from the command module and prepared for its descent to the moon's surface. But suddenly, Aldrin noticed that the navigator had triggered a 1202 alarm. The command center quickly reported that the onboard computer was overloaded with tasks, and the navigation system was struggling to keep up. The lunar module began veering off course, heading toward a dangerous, rocky area. Realizing the imminent danger, Commander Neil Armstrong took immediate action. He switched to manual control to avoid a catastrophic landing. To make matters worse, the fuel gauge showed alarmingly low levels, and the rocket engine stirred up space dust, making visibility nearly impossible. Even as they were on the verge of crashing, Buzz Aldrin never lost faith in his partner for a moment, and he was right. Neil Armstrong skillfully managed to land the lunar module safely on the moon's surface. As the mission commander, Armstrong was given the honor of being the first to step onto the moon, with Aldrin following closely behind. Buzz had no idea then that this sequence of events would lead him to be forever remembered as the second man on the moon, despite his distinguished status as Colonel Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin, known for his strong belief in science and the pursuit of knowledge, also had a deep faith in God. This belief was so important to him that he brought a communion kit aboard the lunar module. As Armstrong prepared for his historic first step, Aldrin took a quiet moment to drink a small drop of wine, eat a piece of bread, and read a passage from the Bible. Only after this private reflection did he put on his spacesuit and prepare to leave the module. For a fleeting moment, he imagined he could smell the moon, which had a scent reminiscent of wet ashes. When Aldrin finally set foot on the moon, he realized he hadn't prepared a memorable phrase for such an extraordinary moment. Unlike Neil, who famously said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," Buzz simply observed, "Magnificent desolation." While on the lunar surface, the team got to work, collecting soil samples, taking numerous photos, and setting up equipment for future scientific research. During their tasks, Buzz suddenly received a radio transmission in his earpiece about an urgent call. He could sense something was wrong. The command center had detected a malfunction, sparking a momentary panic as the possibility of being stranded on the moon loomed. However, to their surprise, it was a call from President Richard Nixon. He inquired about their progress and well-being and told them they had become the most famous people on Earth. After the conversation, Buzz planted the American flag on the moon and, along with Neil, left a few mementos, postage stamps, coins, an aluminum plaque with a message for any future civilizations, and, most importantly, a commemorative medal honoring the Apollo 1 team. After spending 21 hours and 36 minutes on the lunar surface, this historic mission concluded. It was time to head back. The astronauts successfully lifted off from the lunar surface and docked with the command module. But real danger still lay ahead on their return to Earth. After their capsule re-entered the atmosphere and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, Buzz noticed something alarming. His feet were getting wet. It turned out that the module had depressurized during the landing, allowing water to start flooding in. Buzz couldn't help but think how ironic it would be to drown in the ocean after surviving such a perilous journey to the moon and back. Thankfully, the rescue team acted quickly, sending a helicopter to the scene to lift both the astronauts and the capsule out of the water. Buzz was incredibly fortunate. Not only had he survived, but he had also completed all the mission's objectives. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the Apollo 12 astronauts. On November 14, 1969, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, Commander Charles Pete Conrad looked out the window of the Kennedy Space Center. The sky was becoming overcast, rain was starting to fall, and strong winds were picking up. The weather was worsening, which threatened to delay the second manned flight to the moon for another month. The crowd gathered to watch the launch was much smaller than the one that had come to see Apollo 11 lift off just 4 months earlier. However, Conrad was informed that someone very important was in attendance, President Richard Nixon himself. Because of the president's presence, the controllers decided not to wait for the weather to improve and went ahead with the launch as planned. This decision would prove to be a huge mistake. At 11:22 a.m. local time, the Saturn V rocket, carrying Charles Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon, lifted off into the cloudy sky. But just 36 seconds after liftoff, a flash of white light surrounded the rocket, and dozens of warning lights lit up in the cockpit. Although the crew had prepared for every conceivable scenario during training, none of them had ever seen so many malfunction warnings go off at once. 16 seconds after the first flash, there was a second one. Conrad tried to focus on the dashboard, but he was overwhelmed. With only a few minutes to decide whether to abort the mission, Conrad was torn. Despite all the warning signals, Apollo 12 was still on course. Conrad hesitated, unsure whether to risk his life and the lives of his crewmates. Then, urgent prompts from the engineers began coming through his earpiece. He needed to find a specific switch and restart the panel immediately. Conrad was furious, every second counted, and in the midst of the chaos, he struggled to keep up. Suddenly, Conrad's colleague Alan Bean sprang into action. He quickly found the right switch, flipped it, and the panel lit up again. The mission was saved, but for how long? The next problem wasn't far behind and involved the rocket stages. The design called for each stage to separate from the previous one after its fuel was depleted. However, due to the issues at launch, one of the stages detached later than planned. Instead of heading into outer space, it ended up in the moon's orbit, potentially becoming an obstacle for future missions. Little did the astronauts know, this part of the rocket would drift through space for over 30 years before a group of amateur astronomers spotted it in 2002. The challenges didn't stop there. During the moon landing, a malfunction was discovered in one of the engines. With great difficulty, the team managed to land the module with minimal damage. The controllers at the command center were on edge, but the troubles of Apollo 12 were far from over. When Conrad first set foot on the moon, his opening line left the main center dumbfounded. Unlike Neil Armstrong's famous words, Conrad quipped, "Whoopee. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." What many didn't know was that before the flight, Conrad had made a $500 bet with reporter Oriana Fallaci, claiming that NASA did not script the astronauts' lines. And that wasn't the only lighthearted moment during Apollo 12. The astronauts had secretly brought Playboy images on board and even took pictures with them on the moon. When Conrad took his first step on the moon's surface, he stumbled and fell. At that moment, he was probably relieved that the entire world wouldn't witness his tumble. The reason? The astronauts had accidentally damaged the antenna of the color camera that was supposed to broadcast their every move. This entire mission was starting to feel like a classic horror movie, where a group of friends jokes around, unaware of the looming danger signaled by the intense background music. While Conrad and his team remained calm, things were much more tense in the Mission Control Center. The white flash that nearly derailed the mission in the first seconds of flight? It was lightning. The resulting malfunctions could have caused the landing parachutes to deploy too early. No one knew for sure if the parachutes would function correctly or if the entire crew might plummet to their deaths. Unable to resolve the issue, NASA decided to keep this information from the astronauts. Thankfully, during their return to Earth, the parachutes opened right on time. Adding to the list of challenges, the astronauts lost several film magazines, and some of the remaining ones were damaged. This was a significant setback for scientists who were eager to study the images. Moreover, some TV channels had already sold advertising spots meant to air during the broadcast of the first ever color images from the moon. With nothing to broadcast, the failed video feed from Apollo 12 jeopardized future funding for the project. However, even with its setbacks, this flawed mission was nothing compared to what would happen with Apollo 13. John, a NASA engineer, was finally getting some rest after a long shift at the Mission Control Center. Along with his colleagues, he had worked tirelessly for over a year to prepare for the Apollo 13 mission. The mission was set to send astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise to the moon, just like those who came before them. Thankfully, the rocket launch went smoothly, and the NASA team remained vigilant, working around the clock to support the crew and ensure no past mistakes were repeated. John was finally able to relax, thinking everything was under control. But then, suddenly, the phone rang. He picked it up and heard the nervous voice of a colleague from Mission Control. There had been an explosion, an oxygen tank in the service module of Apollo 13 had blown up, and the astronauts were now slowly losing air. John felt his heart skip a beat. Despite his short time at NASA, he had already earned a reputation as a technical genius, someone who could quickly solve complex problems. Without hesitation, he turned on the recording of the conversation with the Apollo 13 crew and heard the now famous phrase, "Houston, we've had a problem." At that same moment, alarm lights lit up in the Mission Control Center, signaling power outages on the spacecraft. It wasn't until later that the NASA Accident Investigation Board would determine that a spark from a bare wire in an oxygen tank had caused an explosion, destroying one tank and damaging another. This not only compromised the oxygen supply but also the power of the Odyssey command module, where the astronauts were located. But at that moment, John didn't know the full extent of the damage. He just knew that every second of hesitation could cost the lives of 3 astronauts. As John considered all the options for an emergency rescue, he faced a serious dilemma. The situation was dire, the oxygen supply on board was limited, and the fuel needed to return to Earth was rapidly depleting. Landing on the moon was no longer an option. This left them with 2 choices. First, they could attempt to return to Earth in the damaged command module using their remaining resources and limited power, but this would be extremely risky. Second, they could use the Apollo lunar module, Aquarius, which was originally designed to land on the moon, as a lifeboat. In the end, they chose the second option. However, this brought a new peril. After redirecting the mission to return home, they had to recalculate the flight path. A miscalculation could lead to the astronauts drifting off into space, lost forever. Despite the risks, it was the best chance they had. The astronauts faced incredible discomfort in Aquarius. The module was designed to hold only 2 people, while the third would wait in the command module. The temperature in the cockpit quickly dropped to near freezing, making it nearly impossible to stay warm. Some of their food had become inedible, and the crew was forced to endure nearly 90 hours in a cold, cramped space with a dwindling supply of oxygen. During that time, Fred Haise developed chills and a bladder infection. On top of all the stress, the astronauts were utterly exhausted due to a lack of sleep during the 6-day flight. Meanwhile, John and the team at Mission Control remained vigilant, tirelessly drafting a plan to get the spacecraft back on the right trajectory. In the end, they successfully brought the astronauts home. Their survival was thanks to their own calm under pressure, the unwavering support of the flight control team. And, of course, John Aaron's quick thinking. Complex challenges confronted not only the astronauts in space, but also the dedicated NASA employees on Earth managing the mission. Following this incident, numerous design changes were made to the service and command modules to enhance safety. In total, 12 Apollo astronauts have walked on the Moon. A feat that might never have been achieved if not for the very first, and most tragic, mission. In January 1967, NASA's top test pilot, Gus Grissom, went hunting with his 13-year-old son, Mark. It was their favorite activity together, but that day, the usually cheerful Gus seemed unusually tense. He shared his worries about the upcoming flight but continued to joke around, telling his wife, "Betty, if I die, have a party." At the same time, experienced astronaut Ed White was busy carving something out of wood before work, enjoying time with his 14-year-old son, Edward, and watching his 7-year-old daughter, Bonnie, practice on a balance beam he had built himself. At that moment, Roger Chaffee was swimming with his 8-year-old daughter, Cheryl, in the pool, eagerly looking forward to the next step in his career as an astronaut. All three men, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, had been selected for the Apollo 1 mission, which was set to be the first crewed flight of the Apollo program. It was an intense technological race between the USSR and the USA. The United States was already trailing, as it was a Soviet astronaut who became the first human in space. Naturally, NASA wanted to make a bold response by sending their astronauts straight to the Moon. The astronauts were doing everything they could to prepare for the flight, scheduled to take place almost a month later. On January 27, they were set for a training launch. The crew was in position, and NASA workers started the countdown. Suddenly, Grissom smelled sulfur, a possible sign of a gas leak. The countdown was immediately halted. Gus was irritated as things began to go awry. After technicians addressed the issue by filling the module with pure oxygen, the odor dissipated, and the countdown resumed. Grissom's frustration only grew as communication problems emerged between the crew, the administrative building, and the launch complex checkpoint. Fed up with the ongoing communication issues, most of the dispatchers decided to step out for a break, except for one. Then, all of a sudden, that remaining dispatcher heard strange noises, followed by frantic screams. "Fire in the cockpit!" came the desperate shouts. More screams echoed through the control room until, finally, there was only silence. Little Mark Grissom was playing near the house when a neighbor's child ran over to tell him he was urgently needed at home. He said something had happened at Mark's dad's work. Meanwhile, Ed White's son came home on his bike after a game of football and saw Neil Armstrong's wife, who lived next door. One look at her face, and he knew something was terribly wrong. In another home, Cheryl Chaffee's mother entered her daughter's room, her face pale and shaken. She softly said, "Daddy won't be coming home again." Scared, young Cheryl asked, "Are you getting a divorce?" Her mother broke down in tears. During the test launch of Apollo 1, a fire had suddenly erupted in the cockpit. Ed White frantically tried to open the inner hatch, but it was designed to open only from the outside. The astronauts had no chance of escape. All three men died. An investigation later revealed that their deaths were caused not by the flames but by carbon monoxide and other toxic gases produced by the fire. This unexpected tragedy devastated not only the astronauts' families but the entire nation. After that tragic incident, NASA overhauled its safety protocols. They replaced the capsule hatch with a design that could open quickly outward, and they changed the spacecraft's cockpit atmosphere from pure oxygen to a safer mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. To this day, there is a commemorative medal on the Moon left by the Apollo 11 astronauts, dedicated to their colleagues from the very first Apollo mission. It's been 51 years since a human last set foot on the Moon. The final mission of NASA's Apollo program, Apollo 17, launched in 1972. But now, NASA has announced plans to send humans to the Moon again, aiming for 2025 or 2026. Would you dare to become an astronaut? On one hand, there's always the risk that something could go wrong at any stage of the mission. On the other hand, everything could go according to plan, and you could have the chance to walk on the moon. Share your thoughts in the comments below.